So the question today for us is, what is fairness? And the first question I want to talk about is, why are we even talking about it? And I'm going to try to be very brief and very bare bones, because the goal of this is to get the panelists, and even more importantly, the audience, to fill in some of the details here and some of the big important issues. So my goal is to lay out a very brief framework as simply and quickly as I can, so that you can do the important work of filling it in. So the first question I want to bring to the table is, why are we even bothering talking about fairness? We probably realize that when we're picking a policy decision, the idea of if it's fair or not is probably not the single most important objective. There may be lots of other objectives. But I'm going to suggest to you that in carbon pricing and carbon policy more broadly, fairness is actually an absolutely essential thing to be thinking about for three main reasons. The first, as we saw with the carbon tax debates and indeed this last election, public acceptance of fairness became a really crucial element of whether a policy works or not. If the public do not think something is fair, you are not going to have broad-scale buy-in, and that may be important. The second one, we know from international negotiations that the criteria of fairness is essential in either making or breaking policy. If you do not get an agreement from everyone around a table that they have a relatively fair deal, you're not going to have agreement. So if we look at British Columbia, who is involved in multiple jurisdiction type issues like the Western Climate Initiative, the question of how to decide fairness with multiple jurisdictions at the table is going to be essential in creating successful multi-jurisdiction policy agreements. So we cannot ignore fairness, it's the crucial element here. And the third one is the idea that climate policy, whether we do it or whether we don't, and how we do it, will necessarily have implications on fairness. Now we have two options. We can decide to not think about them ahead of time and risk having worse impacts because we just haven't thought about it. Or we can try to think about them ahead of time and design policy which aims to reduce the worst fairness implications. So these are three reasons why we need to pay attention to fairness in carbon pricing, particularly, and carbon policy more broadly. So there's going to be two more big questions I want to bring to your attention. The first one is, who even counts? Climate policy will have impacts. That's why we do it. There's no point in having a policy if we don't intend on having some impacts. And it will have impacts both within British Columbia, but also way more broadly than this. The whole idea of a mitigation policy is, in fact, that we are reducing global climate change, which suggests that there are, in fact, stakeholders outside British Columbia who matter. So we can't even evaluate a policy until we decide who's going to be included as a stakeholder. It would be like doing a cost-benefit analysis without actually any idea of what you're comparing. We can either look at the current British Columbians and say, well, they're the only ones that matter, but there are other categories too. Do we consider future British Columbians, other species, people who don't live here but live somewhere else, or future people who don't live here and live somewhere else? There's a whole range of options here. I'm not going to suggest that the appropriate scope for provincial policy is in fact all of these. For this purpose, I'm going to bound mine to pretty much future and current British Columbians. But as I do this, I want all of you to remember in your mind that British Columbia is indeed a small piece of this. And we cannot talk about fairness in true honesty without recognizing that in focusing on British Columbia, we are taking a partial slice of this. Now the second question that comes up is the idea of, okay, so we think that fairness matters, and we've decided roughly who counts in this given context, and there's probably debate in this room about who counts. The next question is, well, fairness is really subjective. What kind of fairness are we talking about? I'm going to take a really simple approach here and suggest that there's three major approaches that are relevant to this debate today. This is not a complete list. There are some really important ones left out, but in the debate today, these are the ones that seem to be coming up as most important in the explicit carbon pricing debates we see. We all know that we have multiple approaches to fairness. Anyone who's dealt with a couple of children can know they'll all use different arguments. Well, it's not fair because he did it, or it's not fair because I needed more, or you can think of many different ways of doing this. These three are the ones I'm going to focus on. The idea of causality, the idea of sharing burdens, and the idea of protecting the most vulnerable. So I'm going to go into these briefly in a little more depth and start laying out what a fair policy along any of these three lines might look like, with the idea that my panelists, and of course the audience, it wouldn't be fair if I didn't share the burden with you of filling in some more of the details. We'll start with causality. So what is the point of causal responsibility? It's really simple. You all use it in your daily lives. Those who cause a problem are responsible for remedying it. Anyone knows this. You break it, you buy it. It's kind of the argument. If we took this seriously and said, okay, what would a carbon policy look like if we took causal responsibility seriously as the primary principle behind the policy? What would it look like? Well, it would have to result in emission reductions. If the whole idea is that you're remedying a problem, if you're not reducing emissions, you haven't gotten very far. It would include broad coverage of emissions. If the whole idea again here is causality is the link which we use to decide what fairness is, if we're not looking at the entire contribution, we're not actually really following the idea of causality. And the final one, we distribute emission reductions somewhat in proportion to current or cumulative. This, of course, is a huge debate internationally, and we may touch on it even provincially. Emissions. The whole idea is we are all contributing, therefore anyone who contributes is responsible in proportion to their contribution. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through each of these in relation to two of the options on the table, the cap and trade and the carbon tax. There's a third one missing, which is regulation, and I'm not going to go to it here because I'm going to assume that someone in the audience at some point in today is going to tackle it head on, and I'm not going to do it myself. The whole idea here is not to do a fairness analysis, but to raise some of the questions we might want to consider as we're looking at these options. So as I mentioned, there were sort of three major criteria. So if we look at the carbon tax and the cap and trade, effectiveness was crucial. Well, it's pretty soon. We just started. We don't really know how these are actually working. They're pretty young. So effectiveness on both of them is kind of fuzzy. The carbon tax looks like it has a much broader coverage relating to that whole call of causal responsibility for broad coverage, but we also know that underneath the surface, the cap and trade, even if it's on industries, if we pass costs through and include those in our analysis, we get a much broader coverage than we look like on the surface. The critical difference here in terms of causality becomes in terms of how we develop the relationship between the emissions and the target. So with the tax, it's relatively clear because it's on every unit. With the cap and trade, this is an area for negotiation. As industries and jurisdictions come to negotiate, it's going to be a much fuzzier thing. So I'm going to put that aside for a moment and go to the second major way of looking at fairness, which is shared burdens. What's the idea here? That collective burdens, something we all have to do, should be shared among everyone involved by dividing them into somewhat comparably burdensome portions. The main logic here is, well, I'll do my part, but only if everyone else does too. I'm not doing it if you don't do it. So this is a really powerful way of looking at fairness. Anyone who's involved in industry negotiations can see right away this is where a lot of the debate is going to land. So if we took shared burdens as a serious principle for policy, what would this require us to do? Again, it would result in actual emission reductions. There's no point in saying we're addressing collective burdens if we don't actually do it. B, it would include broad coverage of all the emissions and everyone considered to be included. Because again, if it's a collective burden and we're all supposed to take our part, we fail that if we don't have broad coverage. And it was supposed to break the burden into relatively, comparatively equal portions in terms of burdensomeness. And I'm sure you're all aware of the crucial problem with this major argument. How you define burdensomeness is the crucial bit of this argument. And that's where the real negotiation happens in terms of either individuals or industries or cross-jurisdictional issues. So as before, this is not a definitive analysis of these two things, it's just some of the things we might want to think about. And again, we have the same issues around unclear effectiveness to date and coverage. But we also have the difference here in terms of how visible burdens are in the two groups. We know with the carbon tax there's been a discussion already about if burdens are fair or not, but at least they're visible. It's very hard to remediate an invisible burden. With the cap and trade, on the other hand, the burdens are visible possibly to industries because they're actually having to sit down, negotiate it, and fight it out. But with individuals, they're very unclear burdens again. If you're looking at pass-through costs, it's very hard to say how much you should get back if you don't even know how much you paid in the price of the good you just bought. So this idea of visibility becomes crucial as we start to evaluate what might be a fair policy. The last one is the idea of protection of the most vulnerable. This again seems pretty intuitive. We should avoid harm to those who are already worst off. It seems profoundly unfair to impose costs on those who are already suffering. So if we took this seriously, what would a policy look like? Those who have the least would contribute the least, if anything. And this is where we must push policy a little further. If we took this seriously, we must consider the idea that those who are impacted by either climate policy or climate impacts themselves, which is after all the reason we have climate policy, are assisted. This may require the generation of funds. Here I'm talking about adaptation. If those who are genuinely the worst off require our assistance, we have to find some way of assisting them. Which means that we cannot separate adaptation from the discussion of mitigation in this case, because we have to come up with those funds somewhere. And carbon pricing may be a really appropriate way of doing that. So let's look at our two options again. Again, I apologize for leaving a regulation, and I hope someone else will do that today. The carbon tax, that we've already talked about, has uneven impacts, but there is visibility, which means some of the things like the northern allowance have been developed to try to make this a little evener. Nice invention of a word. Revenue neutrality is really important in one hand, but we must also recognize that full revenue neutrality means we have no money for adaptation generated through carbon pricing this way. So we may actually be breaking a tenet of protecting the least vulnerable if we followed a strict policy which said the carbon pricing is always only going to be revenue neutrality. Something to think about anyway. With cap and trade, again, we have the unclear burdens on individuals, so it's really hard to know if we're protecting the most vulnerable. One of the good things about it, though, is as companies negotiate, vulnerable companies and industries can have a good leverage point here. So if we're worried about protecting industries, not necessarily individuals, the cap and trade may give us more leverage to follow this principle through. And again, unless there's some revenue generated through this, for example, through the auction of emission permits, this one may break the idea of protecting the most vulnerable if we include adaptation as the most vulnerable. I'm just going to wrap up here with a few final thoughts. The idea of effectiveness, the distribution and visibility of costs, the potential for remediation, and the idea of generating funds for adaptation are some of the issues we need to think about when we're talking about the fairness in these different approaches. And there's a couple of big questions I'm going to pose to get the conversation started. I'm going to go back to the idea of who counts. BC is a partial slice of the larger picture, and can we genuinely be saying that we're respecting fairness if we remain solely focused on a BC scale? Which approach? I've mentioned three: causality, shared burdens, and protection of the most vulnerable. We all in our lives use different approaches for fairness in different situations. If we have to make trade-offs, we need to think hard about which one of these approaches is most appropriate in this case. Finally, can we really judge the fairness of carbon pricing or climate policy broadly by mitigation alone? As I just suggested, if we take the idea of burdens broadly, and if we understand burdens as the burdens of climate impacts, we may have to incorporate funding for adaptation measures within our carbon pricing and climate policies in order to meet the requirements of fairness. So with that, I'm going to close and open up for analysis.
All right, well, I'd really like to thank PICS and Sustainable Prosperity and other sponsors for putting this on and holding this session. It's an honor to be here to speak to you about some of the work that we've been doing at the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives and how this fits with climate change and policies that are more equitable. We just launched it's actually, the project's been around for a couple years, but we just got a 5-year research grant from SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, because we were told not to use acronyms too much. And that's actually a collaboration with the SCARP, the School of Community and Regional Planning at the University of British Columbia. It's a fairly large group. We have a wide number of academics from the various BC universities, and also community partners in terms of the main environmental NGOs, trade unions, anti-poverty groups, and a number of others, some of whom are in the room today. We've already put out a few publications which are available to look at on our website, and I'm going to be speaking to some of the content of those, and we're just basically ramping up a whole bunch of new projects under this umbrella, looking at the intersection between climate policies and social justice, or essentially how these policies play out on the ground in terms of their social and economic impacts. So, we're coming from the place where the other inconvenient truth of our time is the growing gap between rich and poor, whether you look at it in terms of income or wealth or other metrics. We think this is an underlying problem, and we're very concerned that climate policies, without design considerations built into them, could actually exacerbate those inequalities. One of the papers we published came out last summer by Colin Campbell of the Sierra Club and Cliff Stainsby from the BC Government Employees Union. They asked the question, if we were to keep global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, assuming that everyone else is on board with that as a mitigation target, and we were to achieve some level of equal per capita emissions by mid-century, what would that mean for BC's mitigation plans? And the answer turns out to be about 94%. That is, from 2007 levels, we need to become effectively carbon neutral by mid-century. And in the interim, we would still be emitting more than our fair share on an equal per capita basis. So the implication is that we couldn't actually stick to a hard carbon budget from now indefinitely that would give each person an equal share of some total stock of emissions that we're allowed to produce. In lieu of that, we would need to make some sort of payments to developing countries, or in particular countries that are below their per capita amounts in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We're also recognizing that the scope of this challenge by mid-century is huge, that this is tantamount to a new industrial revolution. We know from past industrial revolutions that immense upheaval can result, and we want to avoid that through careful planning so that we have a transition that is fair and equitable. We think that there's a lot of scope for coming up with policies that are win-win, that meet the core environmental objective in terms of mitigation, but we're also looking at adaptation as well, but that also make for a more equitable society. And as Sonya pointed out, part of the rationale for doing this is to ensure that we move ahead with broad-based public support. So this is a publication that came out of our national office last summer. Don't look at the numbers at the top too much. You probably can't even see them very well anyways. This is taking the concept of the ecological footprint developed by Bill Rees at UBC, who's also part of our research team. Pete McKenzie, Hans Messenger from StatsCan, and Rich Smith from Environmental Defense basically crunched the numbers and looked at the ecological footprint by decile. Now, this is not exactly the same as carbon footprint or CO2 emissions, but they're highly correlated. And what you find is, as you would expect, people with higher incomes consume more, and therefore they have a bigger footprint. I think what's particularly striking is the jump from the 9th decile to the top decile. So what you see ranked in the chart are groupings of 10% of the population, from the lowest 10% to the highest 10%, and then the final column is an average across all of those groups. They also break it down by a number of consumption categories. So food is interesting in that there's actually very little difference from the top 10% to the bottom 10% in terms of ecological footprint as it relates to food. I mean, everyone basically has to eat. There's a little bit of an increase at the top, but it's not huge. Food is actually, for most income deciles, is actually the single largest source of their ecological footprint. Mobility ends up being the biggest divergence between rich and poor in this situation. So you can envision people with higher incomes are more likely to have larger and more vehicles, to do more traveling, particularly by airplane, this sort of thing. Low-income people generally don't do as much traveling. To the extent they do, they're much likely to do it by walking or going on public transit. So mobility is a huge factor in here. So basically a ratio of 9 from the top decile to the bottom decile. Housing is also important. More than 2 times the impact. People with higher incomes tend to have larger houses. And then, similar arguments can be made for CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions that are embodied in the goods and services that we consume overall. So, on average, when you aggregate over all of this stuff, the top 10% have a footprint that's 2.5 times larger than that of the bottom 10%. So the key point here is that starting points matter. I mean, none of this discussion of fairness would actually matter at all if everyone had the same starting point, but we don't, and that's the world we live in. And so we need to think about that when we're designing policy. This is just to illustrate some of the transit side of things. This is from the Sightline Institute. Clearly, people driving alone in their cars, particularly if they're in SUVs, have a much larger footprint per mile traveled than people who are taking the bus or biking and so forth. And there's sort of a range in between of different transit options as they relate to how we get around and again, who's disproportionately responsible for the situation that we find ourselves in, to kind of put it back to what Sonya was saying. Coming out of this overall, I think it's important to think about how these policies affect low-income families. They are the ones who have the smallest footprints, but I think they're particularly vulnerable to climate policies and carbon pricing in particular. If we don't actively think about how we address the impact for low-income families in the design of our policies, then we will have adverse impacts for them. There's a few channels by which this works. To some extent, the idea behind increasing the price of carbon emissions is to change behavior on the margin so that people are consuming less. I think there's another side of that which is actually, in the long term, probably more important, which has to do with upgrading your capital stock. And in the case of your house, it's the weatherization of your building envelope, the appliances they have, and the overall level of efficiency that they have. There's a number of other reasons why low-income households are more vulnerable when it comes to those sort of things, because if they're tenants, they don't have the decision-making ability to make those upfront capital investments, and in general generally have less income and assets by which to take those proactive measures to affect their carbon emissions. And they're also coming at a starting point where the share of their income going towards the carbon tax or energy and electricity costs will be higher. So we did a study that came out last fall looking at BC's carbon tax and asking the question, is it fair? This first graph basically shows groupings of 20% or quintiles from the lowest to the highest. And as you would expect, because higher income families consume more, they also pay higher carbon tax. And what we've done here is we've amalgamated the direct costs of carbon tax, which are the fuel you burn, and the indirect costs, which are the embodied emissions and all the other stuff that you purchased. Now the trick is, when you look at it as a share of income, because that's ultimately what is going to matter more in terms of how this affects different families. And here we have this typical regressive result, meaning that higher income families pay a lower share of their income to the tax than lower income families do. But that's not the end of the story, because what happens with the revenues matters a great deal. Now this is a bit of a dog's breakfast, so I'll just speak to it briefly. If you want more detail, you can look at our paper. But the BC carbon tax reallocates revenues in 3 ways. Corporate income tax cuts, personal income tax cuts, and a low income credit. And what happens in the blue is that in year 1, the system is actually progressive through most of the distribution. That the bottom 40% or bottom 60% of banks actually get more back in the credit than they pay out in carbon tax.
So this is what we call a progressive result. The problem is that the credit doesn't grow in line with the carbon tax itself. So as of this July, that totally flattens out through the bottom. And what you end up having in the distribution is a transfer of income from the fourth quintile to the top quintile. And then over time, by 2010, the system essentially becomes regressive and increasingly more so. If nothing is changed, it's a very easy change to make, but if nothing is changed in terms of policy design, we'll end up with a very regressive system. And we want to make sure we get the policy design right, because ultimately this type of system is what we want to scale up fairly dramatically in terms of achieving the outcomes that we're all here to talk about. Another slice of this is that, not necessarily all of the income, I think, should go, I'd say maybe half of it should go towards supporting low-income families, but the other half shouldn't go to tax cuts. I don't think the economic benefits of there are particularly large, but I think they could reinforce our mitigation objectives by investing in things like public transit, home energy retrofits, alternative power, a whole bunch of things like that. So, final point, we want to keep everyone on the bus. I think BC's made a really good start on climate actions and to an extent has taken some of these issues around fairness into consideration, and we're happy to see that. But there's a lot more to be done, and we need to make sure that we think about how we design policies in a clever manner to ensure that everyone is still on board. Starting points matter. And we need to sort of think about bigger questions, and I think Sonya was getting at some of these things as well. To what extent is it all right for higher income people to essentially just pay the tax and sort of buy their way out of change? Or to what extent do we want to have a system that drives change for higher income people in terms of regulations or standards or even quotas on total emissions? And where are we going to go to over the coming years, because essentially all of the low-hanging fruit has been harvested at this stage. We're getting to the stage now in terms of mitigation where the difficult choices and trade-offs need to be made. And just a final point, which is to say that we should be thinking about this beyond typical GDP or income or consumption measures. There's a lot of literature around life satisfaction and social capital that actually finds that beyond a minimum level of income or consumption, people don't actually get any happier with more consumption and more income. It actually matters a lot more about your community, your family, the status of your health, and education. So if we put this in sort of life satisfaction terms, then I think we'll also sort of get better results that are going to work for everyone. Thanks.
I come to this question of fairness and carbon pricing as a political scientist, an observer of politics. And fairness is definitely a perennial theme in politics. Every voter demands and every politician promises policies that are fair to one and all. What I'm going to argue, though, is while that sounds good, you would think if our politics are preoccupied with fairness, it would make it easier to achieve agreement on fair outcomes. I think that the debates we've been having about climate change have tended to exacerbate the already challenging problem of coming to agreement on what's fair. Sonya's presentation reveals that even dispassionate academic philosophers disagree about which policies are most equitable, not least because there are multiple dimensions to fairness and there may be a need to make very real trade-offs among them. However, in politics, the task of agreeing on what's fair is even harder. Most importantly, political arguments about unfairness are often voiced by those who are disadvantaged by a given policy or by those who are seeking their votes. That's not to say that the claim of unfairness is necessarily wrong or illegitimate. Those who disproportionately pay a price for a particular policy, not surprisingly, are the ones who are going to be most keenly aware of any unfairness. But it also means that principled questions about distributive justice are invariably entangled with questions of self-interest. In the real world of politics, no one lives behind a veil of ignorance. Let me offer a few specific ways that I think both our political system and voters' attitudes have made it more difficult to reach agreement on what's fair. And I'll offer 3 points for each, the political system and the voters. So first off, our political system is, as you all know, defined by territory. National borders, provincial borders, and finally, individual ridings. And this speaks to the question that Sonya raised about who counts. At the national level, the trajectory of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions attests to the fact that Canadian politics pays very little heed to arguments about fairness made by those who live beyond our borders, including citizens of developing countries who have contributed very little to causing this problem of climate change and who will suffer and are already suffering disproportionately the impacts of our actions. Within Canada, both our federal political institutions and our first-past-the-post electoral system tend to privilege arguments about regional fairness. So when we talk about shared burdens in politics, we tend disproportionately to talk about fairness in regional terms. Although I've seen no evidence that the most significant differences in impact of the BC carbon tax are regional. In fact, this morning we saw evidence that that's not the case at all. The question of whether the tax is unfair to those in the north or whether it's been unfair to rural communities has been a prominent refrain in BC politics because politicians get elected in territorially defined ridings. And even the left-leaning New Democratic Party has had more to say about fairness based on region than on income, the kind of evidence that Marc has just presented. At the national level, we hear similar arguments that carbon taxes will be unfair because they'll result in a regional transfer of wealth from provinces, particularly Alberta and Saskatchewan, to other provinces. Indeed, region is so sacred in politics that we don't hear a lot of voices, and certainly not politicians' voices, questioning whether that's even a legitimate way to think about this. Maybe pricing carbon should disproportionately affect Alberta, not because it's the province of Alberta, but because economic activities in that province tend to produce more greenhouse gases. Maybe those who commute long distances to work in SUVs should pay more in a carbon tax, not because they live in some distant suburb per se, but because they're producing more greenhouse gases. The second point about our political system is that it's characterized by relatively short time frames. Apart from the obvious difficulty of weighing fairness to those who are not yet born, let alone registered as voters, regular elections tend to focus voters' attention on a temporal baseline. How am I doing relative to 4 years ago or even last year, not how does our society look compared to some ideal of distributive justice. And third, politics is, and this is not going to come as a big surprise, partisan. That's especially true, though, with the combination we have of a first-past-the-post electoral system and parliamentary government. Our political parties have every incentive to oppose each other and virtually none to cooperate. And given the resonance of fairness arguments, particularly unfairness arguments with the electorate, the parties have pulled out all the stops in both the federal and BC elections most recently with a variety of more or less legitimate arguments. Carbon taxes have thus been attacked as an unfair tax grab from the right and from the left as unfairly letting big polluters off the hook. More on the big polluters in just a minute. So on to the voters. Again, 3 points. First, voters tend to have a negativity bias. They're more likely to notice and resent a cost imposed on them by governments than they will notice and appreciate a benefit of comparable magnitude. A benefit that takes the form of a foregone cost is practically invisible. So paying less in taxes than you would have, getting hit less hard with a stick, doesn't feel like getting a carrot. Voters thus noticed the 2.4 cent per liter carbon tax at the pump, and if they didn't, there were partisan reminders about the so-called gas tax, but they were not swayed either by the $100 one-time climate action dividend, let alone the compensating tax cuts that came months later and will continue in years to come. Second, voters are for the most part inattentive to environmental issues. Don't get me wrong, voters care about the environment. They think we should be doing something about climate change. They love the Kyoto Protocol. But for the most part, most of the time, climate change has not been a top-of-mind issue. And we had this moment from late 2006 until the spring of 2008 when climate change was at the top of the public's agenda. The end of that period was when the BC carbon tax was announced. And that was the first time we'd seen that in about a generation. However, By the time the BC carbon tax took effect last July, the environment had been eclipsed at the top as the top of mind issue among voters by, of all inconvenient things, the price of gasoline. In the longer term, though, I think the public's inattention to environmental issues, especially after the economic crisis, actually probably helped to save BC's carbon tax. By last month's election, the top issue for most voters was the economy, on which the Liberals had a comparative advantage. In other words, I'd argue that the BC Liberals were re-elected despite their carbon tax rather than because of it. Finally, voters are not especially well informed about carbon pricing options. And therein, I think, lies the big advantage of cap and trade over carbon taxes. As I'm sure everybody in the room would agree, cap and trade will entail very real costs for individual consumers, but those indirect costs passed on by large industrial sources or fuel distributors are both less visible and less well understood. That was critical in underpinning the NDP's critique that cap and trade would make the big polluters pay, in contrast to a carbon tax's unfair impact on average British Columbians. And I think it also goes a long way to explaining politicians' embrace of cap and trade, for the most part relative to carbon taxes in both Europe and North American jurisdictions. The problem, though, is that there's been virtually no public debate, at least in Canada, about issues of fairness as they arise with cap and trade. And so there's a risk that we will opt for a particular policy, cap and trade, on grounds of perceived fairness that is actually less fair. So to conclude, I think one general point is that implicit in the argument about making big polluters pay is an assumption that this problem was created by someone else and it's thus unfair to impose any costs on me. That this argument should resonate politically is perhaps not surprisingly, given what I've already said about voters' selective attention to costs rather than benefits and their limited understanding of the policy options. However, I think it's also, to some degree, a response to the last 2 decades of political rhetoric, both by interest groups, by think tanks, by academics, and by politicians of all partisan stripes. Understandably skeptical of the depth of political will and fearful of public backlash, politicians have assured voters time and again that they can have it all. They've emphasized that a healthy economy and a healthy environment go hand in hand, and so it must. But I think all too often, we have, in emphasizing the long-term economic benefits, we've sidestepped, quite conveniently, any mention of the short-term costs of the transition to getting there. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised now that voters are taken aback that there will in fact be real costs, and that they eagerly seize arguments that those costs must be unfair. So to conclude, today the political debate about the fairness of various policy options to pricing carbon has been replete with ignorance and misinformation, and I think the only remedy to that is information and meaningful public dialogue. Thank you.
My goal here was to disagree as much as possible with everything that's gone before, just in order to induce discussion. That's hard to do because I end up agreeing with much of what's been said, but I'm going to try and find some points of disagreement. I just want to make 4 points that will give a slightly different tack, I think, to some of the things that have been said, and may be sufficiently polemical and uninformed that you would want to respond. Number 1, I think it's pretty clear, actually, that the carbon tax, or a carbon tax, is actually the fairest possible climate policy if and only if it is revenue neutral. So this is not entirely inconsistent with what Marc is saying, but I would argue for having every penny of it being rebated. No use of the carbon tax revenues for targeted green expenditures. This is a reversal of what I've believed for a very long time, and I've come to sort of painfully over the last year. So let me explain that point. I think revenue neutrality is, in fact, the best way for climate policy to address fairness issues. I think most other climate policies are deeply unfair because they don't pay explicit attention to the kinds of issues that Marc alluded to. The direct and indirect expenditures by income decile or quintile are pretty striking. Not the total expenditures, as Marc pointed out, but the proportion of income that's paid by low-income families on directly and indirectly on energy is much higher than the proportion of income paid by higher income parts of the population. So any climate policy that is going to increase expenditures, and I'd argue that in fact the only effective ones, drawing a bit on what we heard earlier this morning, are ones that do increase costs. We can't get where we want to go. We can't get the effects we need without increasing costs. But those cost increases in every other form of climate policy are generally obtained in a way that makes it very hard or impossible to deal with the fairness issue. So cap and trade type policies, regulatory type policies, it's not impossible to deal with fairness. But in general, they're just not part of the policy package at all. A carbon tax raises explicitly the question of what you do with the revenues in a way that other policies don't, and can way more easily be turned into a policy that explicitly addresses fairness questions, at least some of the fairness questions, not necessarily all of them, to return to Sonya's one. So a revenue-neutral carbon tax, as we see in the form in which it has been developed in the first year of its incarnation here in BC, is actually progressive. It's not regressive. It becomes regressive not because of any inherent nature of the rebate, like the tax rebate policies, but because the actual low-income component of that doesn't rise as fast as it needs to overcome the increasing cost of the carbon tax. That's a stroke of the pen, as I think Marc also suggested, to fix, such that the carbon tax will continue, as it is in the first year, to be progressive. In fact, what that means is the lower the income, the relatively more you benefit from having the carbon tax in terms of the tax rebates. Right now, as we know, 100% of the tax has to be returned in tax rebates. And right now, the average homeowner pays 30% of the tax and gets 70% of the rebates. Industry pays 70% of the tax and gets 30% of the rebates. There's a significant shift of revenue or tax benefit into the hands of homeowners generally, and because of the low-income provisions, that's disproportionately beneficial to low-income families. Now, as we heard this morning, that 70-30 and 30-70 is now going to be 70-30 and 50-50. In other words, it will still continue to be the case that 70% of the tax will be paid by industry. But now, instead of 70% of the rebates going back to homeowners, it's going to be 50%. So there's a shift there. But notice that's still beneficial. As a homeowner, in general, independent of income level, you're benefiting from the carbon tax. You will actually be financially better off with the carbon tax than without. Moreover, if the low-income policy is maintained and extended in future years, you'll do relatively better the lower your income. That's pretty powerful. There aren't too many policy packages that are likely to have actual behavioral implications. They're likely to reduce emissions, to come to Sonya's first criteria, of actually having effect. There's very few of them around that one is able to build these kinds of progressive outcomes into. So that's my first point. The carbon tax, a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Don't take the revenues and spend them on green initiatives at all. Take those revenues, put them back in tax rebates, then you can address fairness explicitly. That's the current situation, and hopefully the province will act so that it will continue to be the case in the future. That's point number one. Point number two, I just want to make a small point about offsets because it's kind of interesting. People react to the concept of offsets in a very negative way. Many people, many in the environmental community. And the reaction to them is kind of, because they're sort of like the indulgences that were sold by the Catholic Church in medieval times, right? You pay and then your sins go away, or you're paying for your sins. And there's kind of resistance to that you shouldn't be able to buy your way out of the evil you do in the world. And I use the medieval church example explicitly because this is often seen in strongly moral and ethical terms, consumption as a kind of an evil phenomenon. So I want to point out that there's a huge difference between voluntary and mandatory on offsets. Huge difference. Voluntary offsets indeed are subject to that criticism because you can choose whether to do them or not, and if you do them, it may indeed be the case that it's to make yourself feel better. If they're good offsets, such as those that are offered, say, by offsetters, just to pick a locally important offset provision organization, then they are reducing emissions. And that's an important point that sometimes gets left out of the moral critique. But my point is a different one. If the offsets are mandatory, which in fact they are in BC, right? Every public sector institution has to be carbon neutral by 2010, by next year. That means they're going to be buying a lot of offsets. And they don't have a choice about that. As soon as the offsets are mandatory, they become exactly equivalent to the carbon tax in influencing behavior. They're a huge outflow that the size of which is the incentive to get off. So UBC, as we're going to hear tomorrow, the 25-year net present value of the carbon tax and the offsets we're going to have to buy as an institution is $42 million. We have a $42 million incentive to get off carbon. That was 0 2 years ago. That's a big incentive. Half of that, roughly, is offsets. And the offsets have exactly the same effect as the tax. Every dollar you have to pay in offsets is an incentive to get off carbon. So this idea that they're an indulgence, that you're just buying your way out of sin, works much less powerfully as a criticism in the case of mandatory offsets. That's just a quick fairness point I wanted to make. My third point is about the BC election. And here I want to take issue a little bit with Kathryn. I agree that the fundamental issue, for reasons beyond the control of any of the parties, i.e. global economic conditions and world oil price changes, was the state of the economy. There's no question. And that was a big factor in the election. Nevertheless, I want to resist the resolutely half-full glass interpretation of the election that I think we heard from Kathy, and say there's something else going on. It's been long believed that carbon taxation, in fact environmental taxation in general, is politically radioactive or toxic, that anyone who promotes it is doomed. And the recent federal election was held as a perfect case in point of this phenomenon. However, the interesting thing is, at least my impression, and I guess we'll find out more maybe in the session tonight, my impression is that the carbon tax issue didn't actually hurt the Liberals, politically speaking. So it wasn't just that they overcame a negative effect by the positive view of their ability to manage the economy. It may have been the case that it actually helped them. Now, this was complicated by the fact that it was, the wrong party doing the carbon tax, right? So the natural supporters of one party who like carbon tax, support the other party, and the natural constituency of the party promoting the carbon tax was hostile to the carbon tax. So it was a complicated dynamic here, for sure. Nevertheless, at least there's sort of anecdotal evidence that the carbon tax issue hurt, the opposition to the tax may have hurt the NDP. That's a very interesting result. If that it turns out to be true, and the postmortems are being done as we speak, if that turns out to be true, that is a counterexample to this universal rule that taxpayers, citizens, hate carbon taxes or any form of environmental taxation. So I think we should just pay attention to that possibility. And finally, I want to echo what Sonya said, instead of disagree with it. We've got to go beyond mitigation. This forum, these 2 days, is mainly about mitigation. However, there's a problem if we sub-optimize on low-carbon economies. The problem with the term low-carbon economy is both terms are wrong, right? Well, carbon isn't the only thing we care about. There's a lot of other factors, and sometimes there's trade-offs, as we heard of the electricity discussion earlier. And secondly, the economy isn't the only thing we care about. It's a broader concern with society. I like sustainable society better than low-carbon economy, and I just want to point out there are equity and fairness issues involved in which frame you use. Thanks very much.
Thank you to all of our panelists for raising a number of provocative issues, which we hope we can engage you in discussion. I have a slightly different rule. One hand starts a new topic. 2 hands say I really want to talk about the one that I just heard and don't let it die. So if you want to get in on a particular theme,